Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Last two videos I put out are on Resident Evil 4, the original, and the remake, and I wanted to do a comparison video and give you my thoughts on which one I think is the better experience overall. I'll be comparing the two and telling you in what categories each one did better than the other one. So first and foremost, let's start off with the voice acting. I've made it no secret that I don't love a lot of the voice acting choices in the remake. I think the original just did it better for the most part. The original had great writing with lots of cheesy quips and one-liners that the voice actor for Leon pulls off to perfection so that they're not stupid or become very memeable. They just work really, really well. They bring enough levity to the intensity of the game while not being too hilarious or too out there, too stupid, whatever. It's not a Jill sandwich experience that we have here. The writing is just done excellently. Now, the writing in Resident Evil 4 Remake is also phenomenal. I like what they did for changes for the characters, but I think the writing and the delivery, especially from the voice actors, is much better than the original than it is in the remake. I think the characters in the remake are a little bit better, specifically Ashley's character. I think the revamping of her character, making her feel more desperate, more terrified, making her a character that actually grows throughout the experience instead of just being this annoying voice the entire way through. I really liked it. I like the changes they made to the lines itself. I like how at the very end she is more interested in joining Leon in like doing the same kind of work he is instead of like inviting him over to be with her. You know, I think the changes that they did there were just fantastic. I think Ashley's a much more well-rounded character. I think that development is fantastic across the board. However, in the original, I think that the villains are much better than they are in the remake. Jack Krauser is really intimidating. He comes off as a very menacing presence. Every time you go toe-to-toe with him, it's a really intense fight. I think Jack Krauser's fights were probably the hardest in the game. Specifically his second fight. I guess the knife fight, the choreography in that one is just a hit or miss, you win or lose kind of thing. But the second fight you have with him, where it's actually guns and making good tactical plays, I think is much better than the original. I had a more intense time, more fun time playing against Jack Krauser in the original than I did in the remake. I also don't love how they kind of took the tension away from the villains in the remake. It seems like Jack Krauser just something about the voice acting performance paired with however the fights came about, they just didn't feel very scary. They didn't make me nervous about winning or losing. I just felt like I was always going to win. Same with Osmond Sadler. I thought he was really boring in the remake. He had much more terrifying moments than the original that they cut to put in the remake. Like the original, Luis Serra dies at the hands of Osmond Sadler. He actually comes out, a giant like spiked tentacle thing comes out from underneath his cloak and skewers Luis Serra in front of Leon. It's a terrifying and harrowing experience that you miss in the remake completely because they decided instead to have Jack Krauser kill Luis. I like that they changed it up. You have Luis get some more screen time. I thought that was a good choice, but the way he died was just really boring for me. I didn't like it nearly as much. It was so much less horror and suspense, especially from the main villain. By the end, when I finally fought Osmond Sadler in the remake, I just didn't feel like I cared about him at all. Now, Ramon Salazar I thought was a scarier fight for his boss fight, but a much less intimidating character earlier on. I like how in the original, he's more kid-like. He just throws temper tantrums and wants to get his way, but then dials it back and pretends to be cool and collected most of the time. I thought his performance was just spectacular in the original, and it was hit or miss in the remake. Although the boss fight was more interesting in the remake, even though it was a little frustrating at times, it was probably one of the harder fights in the entirety of the game. Now let's go to boss fights now while that we're on the topic here. The original had much better boss fights across the board. It's not a contest. Every boss fight was stressful and intense from the very beginning all the way to the end. There isn't any I can really think of that weren't really fun. You have the lake monster at the very beginning is great in both games. Same with El Gigante. Both games pull off the first two bosses spectacularly. They're intense, they're scary, they do their job perfectly. But then Resident Evil 4 keeps rolling with the Village Chief. Village Chief fight is terrifying. After you get to the second phase, it's even more terrifying. The remake devolves it into an on-rails kind of dodge a couple things and shoot him a few times, which is really boring. And that happened with so many bosses. I felt kind of bummed out that they didn't put more time and thought into them, aside from, again, Ramon Salazar, whose was completely revamped from the original. The only one that really, I guess, was okay was Osmond Sadler at the end, because his fight felt very similar to the original, which isn't crazy. I don't think he is the best boss fight, but it's not really boring like everything else in the remake. Now let's talk about some other things that I really liked about the original. Now, I really love the shift in perspective that they had from the original, like the original 3 games in the series. I like that they went from tank controls to the over-the-shoulder. It's fantastic. It was a phenomenal change at the time. When I originally played it, I remember thinking, this is revolutionary. This is going to change how third-person shooters are portrayed across the board, and it absolutely did. Games like Gears of War, all the way down to the Dead Space series, all took inspiration from Resident Evil 4, and they did a marvelous job with that perspective. I think that was something to champion at the time. Resident Evil 4 Remake, I was worried that there'd be some because it was too similar, I thought it would be not a big enough change to notice anything. I like that they did things a little bit differently. I love the free moving while you're aiming, especially in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Having to stop in the original before you aim is a little tedious. But one thing I really did like about the combat in the original was the predictability of being able to stun enemies. Shooting them in specific spots, you're rewarded for your aiming. In the remake, while it does add to the intensity that you don't always get a stagger out of a headshot or hitting him in the knee or specific weak spots, it does take away some of the skill of hitting them in specific spots. Sometimes you hit them in the head and it doesn't do anything. You have to hit them a couple times in the head. Now, I praised in my remake video the combat was a little bit better, and I think it is better than the original overall. But the unpredictability of when enemies were going to stagger is a little frustrating at times. There were times where I'd get overwhelmed because I was hitting really good shots. I was taking my time to aim things, but some enemies just tank right through them, and it didn't seem consistent for me. I didn't really understand why. I think that if there was more consistency, the Resident Evil 4 Remake would have that hands down. But in every other regard for the combat, Resident Evil 4 Remake does an excellent job. I like the not the laser dot. I like that you can unlock the laser dot by trading the spinels for them, but I like that you have just the more inaccurate aiming, because that's more realistic. You're not going to have a laser sight that's with pinpoint accuracy for a gun, especially in a tense situation where you have multiple enemies coming at you. I think that is a more a good vehicle for a horror experience than a laser dot sight. So I think the remake does most things better in the combat department than in the original. Now, across the board, I think the treasure system in both, I think they're unique and interesting. I prefer the original's treasure system overall. I think having unique treasures that go in unique items to combine them together to make something really expensive is much more interesting than just generic gems that fit into these treasures. But I like that they kept a lot of the unique treasures from the original, like having the butterfly lamp just with different slots now this time. I like that they kept a lot of the flair from the original. I like how many options there are. I just don't like the gem system nearly as much in the remake, but they're both really great. They add some diversity to how you're going to go about selling things and what point you're going to sell them. Do I need more money now? I like that both really integrated that into their system. They do it really well. Same goes with the gun range. They really knocked it out of the park. I don't think I talked about it in the original video much, but the shooting range in the original is super fun. It's a mini game. You get 4 different points where you get, I think, 3 different waves, maybe it's 2, where you get different weapons for each wave. You have like a pistol for one with a shotgun, and then another one you might have the machine gun and a sniper rifle. So you get a specific loadout for whatever wave that you're doing, and if you can get a high enough score, you get little figurines that go in just a little display case for you, and they're really fun to see. I liked unlocking them. You uncover different shooting ranges the further you get into the game, and when you unlock the whole thing, you have the whole set. It's awesome. But the remake, they revamped it and made it more complex and made it much different as well. Instead of having fairly basic enemy patterns and the shooting in the original, instead of having that really basic, they revamped it entirely and made it really dynamic. You have still like the 3-row system where you have little cardboard cutouts pop up at various intervals and you can shoot them. They come out very predictably. But instead, now they have a certain amount of little skulls on individual targets. If you can hit all the skulls, you unlock a check mark at the end, which goes toward giving you some extra coins to trade for the little keychain guys. You have other objectives like getting secret objectives when for each thing has a specific thing that if you, for each challenge that you have in the shooting range, you have a specific goal to meet that's secret. And if you hit that goal while doing it, like hitting every target without missing, you unlock a bonus round at the end to get extra points. And sometimes skulls are hidden in those bonus rounds. So it requires a lot of experimentation and figuring out and being more accurate. And I really love the gun range in the remake. I love that they changed a lot instead of just resting on what made the original so good. I like what they did almost across the board. It's fantastic. I like both of them about the same, but the remake might have the edge there just a little bit. Maybe. I also really love the atmosphere of the remake. I love that they start off really emphasizing the horror. There are so many instances where, like the original, you had so much action, you had so many opportunities to have ammunition and healing items that some sections didn't feel particularly stressful. Excuse me. But in the remake, they really, really hone in on that, the horror aspect right from the get-go. And you feel it in every bit of the gameplay. And they do that probably for the first full act of the game. I have to praise them for really focusing on that horror to set it apart from the original. Now, unfortunately, it drops the ball later on in the game. It does devolve more into an action-focused game. And it's a little disappointing because I think if they would have stuck with the horror theming, I would have really made this game like one of the best Resident Evil, probably the best Resident Evil game of all time, because the horror really worked. It really hit me hard in the first act of the game. I was terrified. There were so many instances where I was really getting the survival horror instead of the action. But then as the game progresses, you get more weapons, you unlock more things. It does feel more like a shootout toward the end of the game. That isn't to say that there aren't some scary instances later down the road too. You have stuff like the Regenerators, the late game enemy that really terrifies you. Combined with remixed areas, especially in that specific instance when you're fighting the Regenerators, you have to do a whole new puzzle that was not in the original game to try and escape. And the Regenerators are absolutely terrifying. And until you get that laser infrared scope, you're a sitting duck. And even after you get that infrared scope, it's sometimes really hard to hit them because of how sporadic they move. It's terrifying, and the remake does a great job of that. I wish that the horror aspect would have stayed present throughout the entire thing instead of having some sections just feel like an action slog. If they would have done that again, it probably would be my favorite of all time. It'd probably be like everyone's favorite of all time. One other thing that I think the remake does better than the original is the enemy designs. Now, I know the original is from 2005 or 2006, one of those 2 years. So it's not like the animations and the original designs are going to be all that spectacular compared to 4K on the PlayStation 5. But I think they did a lot to evolve the characters, the enemies and the enemy designs in ways that made them even more unique and more special. For instance, the enemies move much differently. If you're aiming at them, they'll stagger and try and duck and bob and weave out of your way. Their really intelligent AI is fantastic. Their designs going from area to area are just like the original. You have just the regular villagers, you have the cultists in the castle, then you have like the military characters. Their designs are just improved upon from the original in really spectacular ways. Same goes for the viruses. The different variants that attack you, they are terrifying. They're way more terrifying in the remake than they were in the original. And I remember really not liking the viruses when they'd spurt out in the original. But in this, they were horrifying. And I have to give props to them for not only updating them visually, but giving them so much more dynamic movement and different dynamic things for them to do. Like the parasite that attaches onto the back of another enemy and has them charge at you. That's scary. That forces you to engage with them, whereas you might be engaging with someone else trying to limit the enemies charging at you. Now you have one coming at you full tilt. I love that they remixed so much of that. Same with the Regenerators. They were terrifying in the original as they lumbered toward you, making horrifying sounds, and you had cramped areas. In the remake, they run at you full speed. They are faster than almost any other enemy. Makes it so you cannot do anything but engage them or do some really fancy maneuvers to get away from them. You have to utilize your parry to stop them with their long, stretchy arm attacks. the way they remixed these enemies is phenomenal. The boss fights may have dropped the ball, but the enemies really shine in the remake overall. I just cannot say enough about that. So I think I've touched on about as much as I really want to dive into in this video. The original, for me, is a superior experience just because it's more consistent overall. While it is more action heavy, and that was the turning point for the series that kind of led them off the rails, I think they struck the perfect balance in the original between action, survival horror, and the funniness, the levity. I think the remake has a lot of those funny lines, but it definitely feels more serious, and that's good at times. But I think the balance that they struck in the original was perfection. The writing, it was out of this world good. I mean, especially for the time. This came out so many years ago, almost 2 decades ago now at this point, and it still holds up to this day, almost across the board. I love the consistency of Resident Evil 4. It feels like a complete experience from beginning to end. If Resident Evil 4 Remake had focused more on the horror side of things and had some better voice acting experience performances from specifically the villains, this would be the best way to play Resident Evil 4. But for right now, I give the edge to Resident Evil 4. For my top Resident Evil games of all time, I have Resident Evil 4 at the very top, Resident Evil 2 Remake coming in close behind, and the Resident Evil 4 Remake coming in really close behind that. So Resident Evil 4 still, Leon Kennedy specifically, still reigns supreme in the Resident Evil series. I'm excited to see if they're going to remake the original Resident Evil or remake Resident Evil 5 next. I might do a review on that one sometime and tell you what I think of Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. But I'm hoping if they do, they make those much better experiences than they originally got. Because Resident Evil 4 truly was the pinnacle of the series until they had made the comeback with Resident Evil 7. It was a turning point toward something that we didn't really want to see with the series. And luckily we got back to it with Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8. So that's my thoughts on Resident Evil 4 versus the remake. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you later.